The smoke hung low over the valley, like a living thing, coiling through shattered trees and broken concrete, smothering what little light filtered through the ash-thickened sky. The ground was torn open by weeks of shelling, pockmarked with craters that steamed faintly in the morning chill. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered again, a hollow sound that seemed to shake the very air. Amid the ruin and chaos, Elena Cruz lay pressed against the dirt, her cheek to the stock of a battered rifle, eyes scanning through a scope clouded by dust. They called her the Avenger in whispers, though she never claimed the name for herself. It had come from the way she worked silent, patient, her shots finding targets that others couldn't. Men with too much blood on their hands had fallen without warning, the crack of her rifle more like judgment than war. She had been a ghost on rooftops, a shadow in the tree line, the unseen hand that tilted battles. But today, for all her reputation, she was just another soldier swallowed by a fight that was slipping away. The order to retreat came sudden, carried down the line with urgency that left no room for argument. Fall back! Fall back! Voices shouted through the smoke, commanders waving arms, squads breaking formation as the enemy pressed harder, closer. Elena stayed prone, covering their retreat, her rifle barking in measured rhythm, each round slowing the advance by a heartbeat. But the tide was too heavy, too relentless. When at last she rolled to one knee, preparing to move, she realized the others were already gone. Through the haze, she caught glimpses of her unit disappearing into the broken horizon, figures growing smaller, swallowed by dust. Her name was not called. No one checked her flank. Whether through oversight or cold calculation, she had been left behind. Pain spread sharp and hot across her side where shrapnel had torn into her earlier, but it was nothing compared to the hollow weight that pressed into her chest. Betrayal stung worse than blood loss. She staggered toward the cover of a fractured wall, watching the last outlines of her comrades vanish, their retreating boots beating a rhythm that would never match hers again. For a moment, the battlefield seemed to fall silent, save for the pounding in her ears. She was alone, stranded behind enemy lines with nothing but the rifle in her hands and the grit that had carried her this far. The realization settled cold and absolute. If she was to live, it would not be because anyone came back for her. Elena slid down with her back to the wall, forcing her breathing steady, forcing the sting of abandonment to harden into something else. Survival was no longer just about living. It was about making her presence known, her rifle speaking where voices had failed her. Every shot from this moment forward would not be just a bullet. It would be a reminder, a reckoning, an answer to being discarded. She checked her weapon, fingers moving with mechanical precision despite the tremor in her limbs. Chamber clear, bolt smooth, scope aligned. The rifle was heavy, scarred, but it was hers, the only constant left in a world of shifting loyalties and broken promises. Her eyes lifted toward the smoke-choked ridge where the enemy gathered strength for their next push. Through the scope, she found them dark shapes against gray ruin, careless in their confidence. She whispered softly, words no one else could hear, a vow carried only by the wind and the steel in her grip. "You left me," she breathed. "But I will not disappear. Not here. Not now." And as she squeezed the trigger, the rifle cracked, echoing across the valley like the first note of a song she intended to play until the battlefield remembered her name. The battlefield did not end when the guns fell quiet. It lingered like a wound that refused to close, smoldering ruins and shattered earth stretching as far as Elena's eye could see. In those first days after she was left behind, survival was simple. Arithmetic: find water, find food, find a place to sleep where the night patrols would not stumble across her. She scavenged rations from abandoned packs, lifted canteens off the dead, stripped ammunition belts from enemies who would never need them again. The ruins became her shelter, crumbling walls offering cover, burnt-out vehicles hiding her from the sweep of searchlights. Each night she stitched her side with trembling hands, reusing a needle blackened over flame, and told herself she would live to see morning. Living turned into more than surviving once the pain dulled. She began to study the enemy. Their boots marched the same patterns through the rubble, their convoys rumbled along the same broken roads, their officers barked orders from the same ruined balconies. She learned their rhythm the way a hunter studies the pulse of prey, until every careless gesture and every routine became an opening. With her rifle, she filled those openings with silence, the kind that came after a shot, when one man dropped and the others realized death had been watching them all along. The first time she cut down a convoy, it was not planned. She had stumbled on it by chance, 3 trucks grinding down a cratered street, guards riding with rifles slung carelessly. She waited until they stopped near a ruined church, then slipped from shadow to shadow, planting charges she'd stripped from unexploded shells. The blast lit the night with a roar that rolled across the valley, and when survivors staggered into the open, her scope found them one by one. By dawn, nothing remained but twisted steel and whispers. The whispers spread fast. Soldiers began to speak of a ghost girl who haunted the rubble, a sniper who never missed, who struck and vanished like smoke. Patrols marched tighter, eyes always on the rooftops, fingers twitching at shadows. Some swore they saw her face in the dark, others swore they heard her breathing in the silence before a shot. She became rumor and warning, a story told in hushed voices around fires. Fear hollowed their ranks faster than hunger. Weeks turned to months, and Elena's legend grew as steady as her kill count. Officers were not safe in their meetings. More than one collapsed mid-sentence with a bullet in the skull. Supply lines that should have run smooth buckled under her interruptions, each truck that left camp a gamble whether it would reach the next outpost. The enemy scoured the ruins for her, but the harder they hunted, the more invisible she became. The rubble was her cloak, the smoke her shield, and the rifle in her hands her voice. Far from the front, her old unit carried the weight of her absence. News had reached them that she never made the retreat, and the assumption of her death became a stone tied to every man's silence. Chief Commander Alden, the man who had called the withdrawal, felt the burden most. In the quiet hours after reports, when the men dozed and the fire burned low, he saw her face in memory focused, patient, eyes steady through the scope. He told himself she was gone, but the guilt was a constant companion, whispering that he had left behind not just a soldier, but the sharpest edge of their blade. And then came the reports. A convoy destroyed, an officer struck down mid-command, a sniper haunting the ruins like a spirit unwilling to leave. The descriptions blurred, but the pattern was undeniable. Alden read the reports in silence, heart tightening as recognition took root. He whispered her name once, softly, as though it might conjure her back. Elena Cruz, the Avenger. The girl they had left for dead. She was not dead. She was out there, and she had become something far more dangerous than the soldier they once knew. She had become the ghost of the battlefield, and her return was already rewriting the war. The battlefield roared with chaos, a storm of fire and steel that threatened to break the last line of defense. Enemy artillery rained down in punishing rhythm, each shell tearing craters into the earth, shaking men from their footing, and grinding morale into dust. The defenders clung to their positions like drowning men to driftwood, rifles trembling, eyes darting to the ridges where the next wave gathered. It was a losing fight, and everyone knew it. Then, without warning, the tempo shifted. An enemy gun crew on the far ridge collapsed mid-loading, their heavy cannon silenced before it could fire. At first it seemed luck, a stray fragment perhaps, but when the second crew fell moments later, the defenders froze and stared. One by one, artillery crews began dropping, not in blasts of chaos, but with the precision of fate. The enemy advance faltered, confusion spreading through their ranks as soldiers scrambled to find the ghost who had turned their power to silence. On a distant ridge, barely more than a shadow against stone and smoke, Elena Cruz lay prone with her rifle steady against her shoulder. Her body was thin, her face drawn and scarred, every line telling of weeks spent living on scraps and fire-blackened water. But her eyes through the scope were unshaken, focused with a clarity born of hunger, pain, and purpose. The rifle in her hands was the same one she had carried the day she was abandoned, scarred and worn, but it had never failed Herond today. It spoke louder than any voice could. Each shot was deliberate, each movement measured. She adjusted for wind, for dust, for the tremor in her limbs that she forced still with sheer willpower. She watched her targets fall and shifted seamlessly to the next, unraveling the enemy's offensive with a patience that felt almost merciful. Crews abandoned their guns, commanders shouted in confusion, soldiers hesitated at the front line, unwilling to step into the reach of a marksman they could not see. The defenders, once pinned and hopeless, lifted their heads as they realized the barrage had thinned. They blinked against the smoke, uncertain if they were witnessing salvation or a trick of fate. Word traveled down the line in broken murmurs. Someone out there was watching over them. Someone was cutting the enemy apart with impossible precision. A name began to stir, first as a whisper, then with growing certainty. The Avenger. The ghost who had haunted the ruins. The sniper who never missed. Could it be her? When at last she shifted position and came closer, dragging herself to a vantage where her silhouette was visible against the smoke-streaked sky, the doubts ended. Faces turned, eyes widened, and the recognition hit like a spark in dry tinder. Elena Cruz had returned. The one they thought dead, the one their commander still carried in silence like a scar, was alive and fighting with them again. A cheer broke from the trenches, ragged and raw but carried on waves of relief and renewed fire. Soldiers slammed fresh magazines into their rifles, shouted her name, and surged back into the fight with a fury they hadn't felt in weeks. The line that had bent under fire now straightened. Men who had been moments from breaking now charged forward, spurred on not by orders, but by the sight of a lone sniper who refused to die quietly. The enemy, once confident in overwhelming strength, faltered as their advance collapsed under the weight of unseen bullets and resurgent defenders. Elena's shots struck like a conductor's baton, directing the rhythm of battle, dismantling the offensive one target at a time until momentum itself shifted. Where there had been despair, there was now fire. Where there had been silence, there was the roar of soldiers reborn. Her return was not just survival, it was a reckoning. Thin, scarred, and carrying the same rifle that had never betrayed her, Elena Cruz had become more than a soldier. She was the spark that turned defeat into defiance, the ghost whose reappearance turned the tide of a battlefield drowning in blood and smoke. And as her comrades rallied beneath her shadow, they understood with sudden certainty. They had left her behind, but she had come back not for herself, but for them all. The battlefield was collapsing into chaos. Reinforcements poured across the torn earth in endless waves, a tide of steel and fury that threatened to swallow the battered line whole. The defenders fired until their rifles smoked, shouted until their throats bled, but still the enemy advanced, inexorable, unrelenting. Smoke rolled low over the field, carrying the acrid bite of cordite and fire. The air was alive with the sound of death screams, explosions, the hiss of bullets tearing the air apart. Every man holding the line knew they were seconds away from being overrun. Elena Cruz moved through the rubble like a woman caught between life and myth. Blood ran down her side where her wounds had reopened, soaking her uniform dark, but she pressed forward, one trembling hand gripping the wall for balance, the other clutching the rifle that had never failed her. Her breath came ragged, her body near collapse, but her eyes never wavered. Through the smoke, she caught sight of the figure commanding the enemy advance general standing tall on a rise of broken stone, his voice carrying above the din, his arm raised to direct the killing tide. Every shot she had ever taken had led to this one. The supply convoys burned, the officers silenced mid-sentence, the artillery crews cut down in their tracks. All of it was preparation, every act of vengeance narrowing to this single chance. She dragged herself up the shattered skeleton of a building, climbing until her boots slipped on blood-slick stone, until the air thinned and the battlefield stretched before her like a map painted in fire and ruin. At the top, she collapsed behind the jagged edge of a crumbling wall, chest heaving, hands shaking. Her rifle lay across the rubble, waiting. She pulled it close, the familiar weight steadying her even as her body trembled. She wiped blood from her brow with the back of her hand, steadied the scope against her cheek, and searched the haze. There, through the shifting waves of heat and smoke, through the blur of movement and chaos, stood the general, still shouting orders, still driving his soldiers forward. He was a phantom in the distance, barely visible, but Elena's world narrowed until nothing existed but his outline in her crosshairs. She slowed her breathing, the way her father had taught her years ago when the rifle was too heavy for her arms and the scope too large for her small eye. Breathe in, exhale halfway. Find the pause where the body is most still, where heart and lungs surrender to silence. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced calm, forced stillness, until the trembling ceased and the world steadied. The crosshairs settled on his chest, then drifted higher, until they rested at the hollow of his throat. One finger curled around the trigger, steady, deliberate. She whispered nothing, made no vow, offered no prayer. Her silence was the prayer. Her shot would be the vow. She squeezed. The rifle cracked, the recoil driving back into her bruised shoulder. Through the scope, she saw the general jerk, saw his mouth fall open mid-command, saw his body collapse like a marionette with its strings cut. For a breathless second, the battlefield froze. Then the collapse began. The enemy advance faltered, officers shouting in confusion as their command structure shattered. Soldiers stumbled, broke formation, some throwing down their weapons, others fleeing into the smoke. The tide that had threatened to drown the defenders receded in disarray, the roar of advance replaced by the chaos of retreat. The defenders surged forward with renewed fury, striking down those who lingered, reclaiming ground inch by inch. At the top of the ruin, Elena slumped against the wall, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. The rifle lay across her lap, smoke curling from its barrel. Around her, voices rose, cheers, shouts, disbelief giving way to triumph. Her comrades climbed toward her, faces streaked with dirt and sweat, eyes wide with awe. When they reached her, they did not see the forgotten soldier left behind weeks before. They saw the Avenger, the ghost who had turned despair into fire, the sniper whose single shot had broken an army. They surrounded her with hands steadying her, voices calling her name. Elena Cruz, the Avenger. Thin, scarred, bleeding, but unbowed. On that day, the battlefield did not remember the soldiers who retreated. It remembered the girl with the rifle, who climbed higher, aimed farther, and pulled a trigger that ended the war.